Let's be honest, you're never coming back here. So let's just yeah, this is exciting. This is special.
I wouldn't count on another 50
good.
years.
It looks good.
Hollywood has always been a place where love stories are made in the spotlight and often destroyed by it. Fame, pressure, and constant public attention have broken more relationships than anyone can count. But every once in a while, there's a story that doesn't follow that pattern. A story that makes people stop and think because it doesn't behave the way Hollywood expects it to behave. Barbra Streisand is one of the biggest names in entertainment history. She is not just a singer or an actress. She is a global icon with a career that has lasted decades. She has achieved success that very few artists in the world can match. Her voice, her performances, and her influence have made her a legend. But behind all the awards, the fame, and the spotlight, there's always been curiosity about her personal life, especially her marriage. In 1998, Barbra Streisand married actor James Brolin. At that time, the news was celebrated by fans and media. It looked like a perfect match. Two successful people, both mature, both respected in their fields, finding love later in life. For many people, it seemed like a peaceful and happy ending to a long journey. But as time passed, people began to notice something different about their relationship, something that didn't fit the usual Hollywood pattern. They were not constantly seen together at public events. They were not trying to present themselves as the perfect celebrity couple in front of cameras. Instead, they seemed to maintain a quiet, private kind of relationship, one that didn't depend on public attention. This surprised many fans, because in Hollywood, couples usually stay in the spotlight. They attend events together, share moments on camera, and build a public image. But Barbra Streisand and James Brolin chose something different. They focused more on their personal space. They valued independence as much as togetherness. And that is where the curiosity began. People started asking questions. Why do they keep such a low profile? Why are they not always seen together? Is everything really normal behind the scenes? But there was no drama, no public fights, no scandals, just silence and privacy. And in Hollywood, silence often creates more curiosity than noise. Over the years, interviews and small comments from both Barbra Streisand and James Brolin showed something interesting. Their relationship was not built on constant public display. It was built on understanding, respect, and giving each other space. They did not try to fit into the traditional idea of a Hollywood marriage. Instead, they created their own version of it. In a world where many celebrity relationships collapse under pressure, their marriage continued quietly, without attention-seeking behavior, without unnecessary exposure, just stability in the background. Some people found this unusual. Some even called it strange, because it did not match what people expect from celebrity couples. But others saw it differently. They saw maturity. They saw balance. They saw a relationship that doesn't need validation from the outside world. What makes this story even more interesting is how rare this kind of relationship is in Hollywood. Fame usually demands attention. It demands visibility. But Barbra Streisand and James Brolin chose privacy instead. And that choice is what made people talk. Over time, their marriage became less about rumors and more about curiosity. Not because something was wrong, but because it was so different from what people are used to seeing. There is no dramatic breakup story here. No shocking scandal. No public controversy. Just a long-lasting relationship that doesn't fit into Hollywood's usual narrative. And maybe that is the reason people still talk about it today. Because in an industry built on publicity, their quiet relationship stands out more than loud ones. It raises a simple question. Is love supposed to be public? Or is it stronger when it's private? Barbra Streisand and James Brolin seem to have answered that question in their own way. Not through words, but through the way they have lived their lives together. And in the end, maybe that is what makes their story so interesting. Not because it is chaotic, but because it is calm in a world that is usually anything but calm. But there is another important part of this story that people often overlook. Because when we talk about celebrity marriages, we usually expect drama, fights, or public attention. But sometimes the absence of drama itself becomes the most interesting thing. Barbra Streisand and James Brolin never built their relationship for the public. They built it for themselves. And that is something very rare in the entertainment world. As years passed, their bond quietly continued. No major controversies. No shocking headlines about their marriage falling apart. Instead, what people saw was consistency, a kind of stability that does not usually survive in Hollywood. And this is where opinions started to divide. Some people believe that a strong celebrity couple should always be visible together. They should show their love publicly. They should appear at events, talk about each other, and present a perfect image. But Barbra Streisand and James Brolin never followed that rule. They created a boundary between their private life and public life, and they protected that boundary very carefully. Because of this, rumors sometimes appeared online. People speculated about their lifestyle. Some even misunderstood their distance from the spotlight as something negative, but there was never any real proof of problems. In fact, every time Barbra Streisand spoke about her life, her words reflected peace, not conflict. And James Brolin also expressed similar feelings in his interviews. He often described their relationship in simple terms based on respect and understanding. That is something very important to notice, because in Hollywood, where relationships are often under constant pressure, even small misunderstandings can become big scandals. But in their case, there was no public explosion, no dramatic breakup story waiting to happen, just a long journey that continued quietly in the background. And maybe that is why the story feels different. It does not give you the usual Hollywood entertainment drama. Instead, it gives you something more subtle, something more real. It shows that not every relationship needs to be performed in front of the world. Some relationships are stronger when they're protected from outside noise. As time moves forward, Barbra Streisand's legacy continues to grow in the entertainment industry. Her voice, her films, and her influence remain powerful even today. And James Brolin also continues his own respected career. But together, they remain mostly away from unnecessary attention. And that silence has become part of their identity as a couple. In a world where everything is shared, posted, and analyzed, their choice to stay private feels almost unusual. But maybe that is exactly why people are still curious about them. Because silence creates mystery, and mystery creates attention. And even without trying, their marriage became one of those rare Hollywood stories that people keep discussing, not because of scandal, but because of simplicity. There is no final shocking twist in their story, no dramatic ending, no public breakup, just a relationship that has continued in its own way, outside the pressure of constant visibility. And maybe the real lesson here is simple. Not all love stories are meant to be loud. Some are meant to be calm, private, and steady. And those stories often last longer than the ones built for attention. Barbra Streisand and James Brolin chose that path. And that is what makes their story stand out in a world full of noise. But there is still something more to understand about why this kind of relationship gets so much attention online. Because in today's world, people are used to seeing everything exposed. Social media has changed the way we think about relationships. If something is not shown, people assume something is wrong. But Barbra Streisand and James Brolin never followed that mindset. They belonged to a different era where privacy was not just an option, it was a value. And that difference is what makes their marriage feel unusual to modern audiences. Over time, fans started analyzing every small detail, every appearance, every interview, every absence from events. But what they often missed is the most important part. A relationship is not defined by public appearances. It is defined by what happens when the cameras are off. And in their case, what happened away from cameras was always kept private. This naturally created a kind of mystery around them. And mystery, in entertainment, always turns into curiosity. Some people even started calling their marriage different or unconventional. But different does not always mean broken. Sometimes different just means not following the common pattern. In fact, many long-term celebrity relationships that are always in the spotlight end up facing more pressure. Constant media attention can slowly damage personal space. But in this case, the balance between public and private life seems to have helped them maintain stability. That is why their story still survives without major controversies. There's also another angle people forget. Both Barbra Streisand and James Brolin had already experienced life before their marriage. They were not young stars chasing fame together. They were mature individuals who had already lived through their own careers, challenges, and personal experiences. That maturity plays a big role in how relationships survive long-term, because when people are older, they often value peace more than attention, and that seems to reflect in their lifestyle. They don't try to prove anything to the world. They don't try to create a public image of perfection. Instead, they simply live their lives in a way that works for them. And that is probably the biggest reason why their marriage continues to attract attention even today. Not because it is loud, but because it is quiet. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is stable. In Hollywood terms, silence itself becomes a story. And when there is silence, people fill it with questions. But after all the speculation, all the assumptions, and all the curiosity, the truth remains simple. There is no confirmed scandal, no confirmed crisis, and no confirmed breakup story behind their marriage. Just two people who chose to live differently from a usual Hollywood pattern. And sometimes that is enough to confuse the audience, because we are used to stories that are loud, emotional, and dramatic. But life does not always work that way. Some stories are calm, some stories are private, and some stories continue without ever needing public approval. Barbra Streisand and James Brolin's marriage seems to fall into that last category. And maybe that is why, even after so many years, people still search for answers about it. But the answer may not be hidden in some shocking secret. It may simply be in the way they chose to live. Quietly, separately when needed, together when it matters, and away from unnecessary attention. And in the end, that might be the most unusual thing about Hollywood after all. Not scandal, but peace. Not chaos, but stability. And that is what makes their story continue to be discussed even today. And when you look deeper into Hollywood history, you start to realize something interesting. The most talked about relationships are usually not the most stable ones. The ones filled with constant headlines often struggle the most, while the quieter relationships, the ones away from attention, often last longer. That is why Barbra Streisand and James Brolin's marriage feels different. It does not depend on public approval. It does not rely on constant visibility. It exists on its own terms. And that is not something very common in the entertainment industry. Over the years, many fans have tried to understand their dynamic. Some try to compare it with typical celebrity relationships, but that comparison does not always work, because not every relationship is built in the same way. Some couples thrive on shared public identity. Others thrive on separation between public and private life. And in this case, the second approach seems to define them more. There's also something very important about long-term relationships that people often forget. Time changes everything. What matters in the beginning of a relationship is not always the same thing that keeps it strong after decades. In the early stages, attraction, excitement, and public attention might play a big role. But in the long run, stability, understanding, and respect become more important. And when you analyze Barbra Streisand and James Brolin's marriage from that perspective, it starts to make more sense. They are not trying to impress the world. They are not trying to maintain an image of perfection. They are simply continuing their lives together in a way that feels natural to them. And maybe that is why there is no dramatic ending to this story. Because not every story is meant to have a shocking conclusion. Some stories are meant to continue quietly. And that quiet continuation is what confuses people most. Because in a world where everything is shared instantly, where every moment is recorded and every detail is analyzed, a private relationship feels unusual. But unusual does not mean wrong. It just means different. And that difference is exactly what keeps this story alive in public curiosity. Even today, when people hear about Barbra Streisand's marriage, they do not think of scandals or controversies. Instead, they think of questions. They think of mystery. They think of a relationship that does not fully reveal itself to the public. And maybe that is intentional. Because not everything needs to be explained. Not every detail needs to be shared. And not every relationship needs to be understood by outsiders. Sometimes, the strength of a relationship lies in what is not shown. And that might be the real reason the story continues to be discussed, even after so many years. Not because something went wrong, but because nothing dramatic ever needed to happen in the first place. Just a simple, quiet, and steady connection between two people who chose a different path from Hollywood expectations. And in the end, that choice itself becomes the most interesting part of the story. When stories like this circulate,